Good morning, and thank you for joining the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom's virtual conversation today on at-risk religious communities in Afghanistan. I'm Dwight Bashir, and I serve as Director of Outreach and Policy at USCIRF. For those of you out there not familiar, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, also known as IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the U.S. Congress. Our work is led by 9 commissioners appointed by the President and the leadership of both political parties in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and is supported by a professional staff of about 20. Religious freedom conditions in Afghanistan have drastically deteriorated since the Taliban seized control of the country on August 15th. In September, despite promises to form an inclusive government, the Taliban announced an all-male, religiously and ethnically homogenous government cabinet. I am joined today by USCIRF Chair Nadine Maenza and Commissioner Fred Davie. Chair Maenza will provide more background on at-risk religious communities in Afghanistan and the State Department's P2 designation, which we'll learn more about. And Commissioner Davie will further highlight the Taliban's history of repression, which affects all Afghans regardless of religious affiliation. We will then hear from our guest panelists, United States Institute of Peace Interim Director of Religion and Inclusive Societies, Palwasha Kakar, and Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service President and CEO, Krish Vignarajah. Afterward, I'll moderate a brief conversation among the speakers with some opening questions. Then we'll have time for some questions from the audience as well. Now, to ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen, and to submit a question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event starting right now. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to USCIRF Chair Nadine Maenza.
Thank you, Dwight. And as you mentioned, since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in mid-August, the outlook for Afghan religious minorities, as well as all Afghans who do not agree with the Taliban's interpretation of Islam, is alarming. The Taliban's imposition of their harsh and strict interpretation of Sunni Islam poses a grave threat to all Afghans of differing interpretations and other faiths or beliefs. For example, last month, the Taliban reinstated the Ministry for Propaganda of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, which includes a notoriously violent hardline Islamist policing system, which was disbanded in 2001. 2 weeks ago, the Taliban's former head of religious police, now in charge of prisons, announced that executions and amputations would resume. The Taliban has intimidated, threatened, and targeted leaders from religious minority communities and carried out violent attacks, as have rival hardline Islamist militant groups like the Islamic State Khorasan or ISIS-K. In August, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a press release stating its grave concern about the Shia minority, who belong predominantly to the Hazara ethnic group or Hazaras. The museum warned that the Hazaras are at risk of crimes against humanity or even genocide. Indeed, massacres and other crimes against Hazaras continue. The last Jew in Afghanistan, Zablam Simonov, left the country last month, leaving behind the last operating synagogue. Some religious minorities would face severe consequences, including death, if discovered. The Taliban's de facto seizure of Afghanistan has led to a rapid decline and near extinction of some communities. In April, USCIRF recommended in its 2021 annual report that the U.S. Department of State redesignated the Taliban as an entity of particular concern, or an EPC, for engaging in systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. The State Department has designated the Taliban as an EPC every year since its first set of EPC designations in 2018. In August, the State Department created a P2 designation for certain Afghan nationals. A P2 category means that individuals within the category can apply directly to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program for processing, instead of first having to apply, be processed, and be referred by the UN Refugee Agency or UNHCR. As a result, it speeds up the resettlement process. P2 applicants still go through a full review to determine that they meet the legal requirement for refugee status, as well as extensive security and health vetting by the U.S. government. USCIRF immediately recommended that the State Department expand its P2 designation to include members of religious groups at extreme risk of persecution by the Taliban. Additionally, in our April 2021 annual report, USCIRF recommended that the U.S. government prioritize for resettlement survivors of the most egregious forms of religious persecution through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program and raise the annual ceiling of refugees who are admitted to the United States. I'd like to now introduce my colleague and fellow commissioner, Fred Davie, who will offer his remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Maenza. As you mentioned, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in mid-August will have far-reaching consequences, not just for members of at-risk religious communities, but all Afghans who do not agree with the Taliban's strict and narrow interpretation of Islam. Indeed, the Taliban's harsh enforcement of its religious interpretation on all Afghans violates the freedom of religion or belief of women, members of the LGBTI community, and Afghans who follow no religion. Religious freedom affords every individual the right to follow their own interpretation of religion or to follow no religion without coercion. The Taliban, in accordance to their restrictive interpretation of Sunni Islam, have segregated men and women in educational institutions, warned working women to remain at home until further notice, banned girls from secondary education, and barred their participation in sports. In September, the Taliban allegedly shot and killed a pregnant officer in Roar province, and further, women on billboards and ads have been wiped out. The Taliban have imposed a dress code on women attending higher education. Women are permitted from wearing vibrant colors, high-heeled shoes, and perfume in public. There are also reports of Taliban forcing unmarried women and minors to marry fighters. As a result of the burdensome rules and harsh punishment, women are now reportedly afraid to leave their homes without male chaperones or proper dress. Even barbers and hair salons have been warned not to give Western-styled haircuts to men or cut beards. These actions violate those individuals' right to follow their own interpretation of Islam or other respective religion or belief. Under the Taliban in the 1990s, music and other forms of entertainment was strictly forbidden. Performing, selling, or even listening to music at home was considered an offense. The Taliban once again are targeting musicians and artists since retaking Afghanistan in August, accusing them of violating their vision of Islam. In July, the Taliban executed a comedian in Kandahar, and in August shot and killed a folk singer in the Baghlan province. Taliban have been destroying musical instruments and have banned music and entertainment programs from airing on television and radio stations. Sunni Muslims who oppose the Taliban are facing serious risks. The Taliban have targeted journalists, human rights activists, and religious leaders. In June 2021, the Taliban assassinated Malawi Aziz Niazi, a widely respected Sunni religious leader of the Wazir Muhammad Akbar Khan Mosque. It is also important to note that an increase in attacks by other extremist groups, most notably ISIS-K, not only threatens Afghanistan's overall stability, but has also decimated religious minorities. For example, ISIS-K has been responsible for multiple deadly attacks against the Shia Hazaras. In May 2020, gunmen attacked a maternity ward in Kabul, killing 24 people, mostly women and children. And in May 2021, at least 85 people, most Hazara Shi'a female students, were killed in bombings outside a high school in a Shia Hazara neighborhood in Kabul. I would now like to turn it over to Palwasha Kakar, the Interim Director of Religion and Inclusive Societies at the United States Institute of Peace.
Thank you so much. First, thank you to USCIRF for hosting this important conversation on religious minorities in Afghanistan. Thank you, Chair Nadine, Maenza, and Commissioner Fred Davie, and Director Dwight Bashir for, is my volume not coming through? Yeah, I am, okay, thank you. For having this important conversation. I will be sharing my own thoughts based on my contacts and experiences in Afghanistan, and none of what I'm sharing is the official position of the United States Institute of Peace. I wanted to make that clear. The United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for US and global security. I work in the religion team, which is one of the oldest continuous running functional teams of the United States Institute of Peace. And given religion's influence on conflict dynamics around the world, we realize at USIP that it's critical that practitioners and policymakers understand and partner with religious leaders and people of faith to build peace. We worked with the US Commission on International Religious Freedom on some of these issues, and so I really welcome this conversation. I wanted to start out by giving a little bit of some background to the history of religious communities in Afghanistan. First of all, there have been traditionally in Afghanistan religious communities, minorities among Sikh, Hindu, Jews. We have Ahmadis, Ismailis, Shias, but then there's also other minorities, including Baha'is, Christians, and then within Sunni Islam also some that have been targeted recently, such as the Ahl al-Hadith. But historically, I wanted to speak a little bit to the Hindu and Sikh population, because the Hindu population has a wonderful history in Afghanistan, where in some accounts the Vedas were actually written in Afghanistan, and there's stories in the Vedas that are placed in Afghanistan. And so there are places that are of importance within the Hindu faith in Afghanistan, cultural heritage sites within Afghanistan that are important to understand. So pre-Islam, Hinduism flourished. In the 11th century, there was a surge of Hindus coming to Afghanistan, and also in the 16th century. In the 16th century as well, the Sikhs were fighting along the border there, and there were territories taken by the Sikhs in Afghanistan, and disputes around land that started during that time. Most recently, when the Ministry of the Republic, the Islamic Republic, did a survey of Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan, they found that Hindus and Sikhs were living in Khost, Kandahar, Ghazni, Kabul, Parwan, Logar, and Kunduz, that they had land and housing in all of these different places. But unfortunately, under various warlords, many of their homes had been confiscated and their lands had been confiscated from them. And they were complaining that they needed their land to be given back to them by the government, and there wasn't a process for settling those issues. So there was discrimination against them, and they were fighting over their lands. And particularly we know of disputes in Ghazni that were very public, not only between the Sikh communities and those that were trying to take their land from them, but also between Hazaras and Pashtuns in Ghazni province. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there were issues around places of worship, not only that the shrines and the places of worship were not being kept or were not being respected, or there was trying to be annexed, but also that activities of worship and cremation were not being allowed, and there was complaints about that. And so there has been historically issues of them not being able to worship appropriately in their areas. The other issue that has also been raised in the past, and that has continued to be an issue of contention and conflict, is that religious minorities were not given equal rights to education in Afghanistan historically. And oftentimes it was because of the requirement of them to have to study a religious subject, and that having to be Islam, and then not giving them marks when there was supposed to be some sort of concessions given to them, nor was there any other alternative curriculum given to them. I was interviewing Senator Anarkali Kaur, and she was telling me how her father had been working in the government and had a government position, but when the Taliban came, he was no longer allowed in the government. So these are some examples of discrimination historically that religious communities have experienced, religious minority communities have experienced in Afghanistan. Of course, we know systemic discrimination against Hazaras was also happening in the past, and there had been some attempts in the recent administrations to remedy that to a certain extent, but that is a historical fact about Afghanistan. Also, under the previous administrations, the Taliban, the previous Taliban administration had required Sikhs to wear identifying colors to be able to identify them. Their justification was that they would wear these colors so that then they wouldn't be told to have beards or be told to follow certain edicts related to Islam, and that they could then be differentiated in that way. But unfortunately, they were discriminated in for these reasons and by having these colors on them. So in my conversations with those that were in Afghanistan recently and asking about some of the conditions that they've been under, where they've been in fear, where Taliban have threatened and have done different threatening postures around the Gurdwaras. Some have said they will bring some sort of security there. Others have come and actually desecrated the sites, and then the Taliban subsequent come and say that wasn't us, those were criminal activities. Those sorts of things have been ongoing. We've also heard of kidnapping happening and assassinations happening that overall are affecting the morale, but more specifically that are targeted towards the Hindus and Sikhs are really unfortunate. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight, because this has come up in conversations, is what would be a litmus test to see that the Taliban have changed, or what are some of the things that we need to see change as regards to human rights and minority rights in Afghanistan. And so I'm going to go through some of the recommendations really quickly here. The first, which I've heard loud and clear, is that equal rights need to be given to all of those religious minorities in Afghanistan. They want to be treated under equal rights as all Afghans. They want to be allowed to work, allowed to go to school, and have equal rights as all Afghans in Afghanistan. And so also having rights, human rights, rights to education, women's rights are important to them as to the rest of the community, and having their rights protected. Furthermore, in previous Taliban constitutional iterations, they have not even mentioned minority rights. So having some specific laws and mention the protection and the status of minority rights is really important, so that it actually be decreed by law. And also being very clear that when they do talk about, for example, rights according to Sharia, that they make clear that rights for minorities are clearly described, that they're allowed to worship and have the right to worship and believe in their own right. The second one is stopping criminal activity towards Hindus and Sikhs and others and minorities. There have been, like I mentioned, targeted kidnappings, attacks on the temples, shrine sites, gurdwaras. Those need to stop. And really showing that they are protecting those sites and providing security for religious minority communities. The third is returning land and homes that were taken by force. We're seeing not only from the previous regimes, but under the Taliban, that land and homes are being taken by force, and those need to be returned back to their rightful owners. And the fourth is protection of cultural heritage sites. We know that, for example, there's a holy site on what is called Television Mountain now of the Hindus, where there is the pure vermilion rock, and many times, well, at least once a year, there is a procession that goes to that site, and it was protected, that remains a protected cultural heritage site, for example. And finally, to be allowed to worship freely. And this is for example, the Hazaras to be able to have their Ashura procession, which they were able to in August, that cremation be allowed, that they end the desecration of any kinds of Hindu and Sikh sites, and that they actually promote and protect those cultural heritage sites. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas, and I'd be happy to discuss this further in the conversation after this.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn it over to Krish Vignarajah of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Dwight. Thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this very important and timely discussion. So as mentioned, my name is Krish Vignarajah. I'm the president and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. We are the largest faith-based national nonprofit dedicated exclusively to immigrants and refugees. So I want to take the time to speak to the evacuation and resettlement of Afghans more broadly, and really contextualize it here at home in the United States. So as many of you know, the US has resettled about 97,000 Afghans since the 2001 US involvement. Of those, about 16,000 were special immigrant visa holders, those that qualified for special status due to their service to the US mission. So when the US government began its evacuation on April 15th, we knew and we saw the chaotic scenes at the airport, and we knew they precluded kind of standard operating procedures. So during Operation Allies Refuge, nearly 130,000 people were evacuated from Afghanistan. Since then, nearly 65,000 have arrived here in the US, including US citizens, permanent residents, and SIV holders. And about 85% of them enter the country under what we call humanitarian parole. And that's really a status that LIRS and other resettlement agencies work with the government to stand up. So in its initial form, the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program, we call it APA, provided resettlement, referred to as relocation assistance, to Afghan parolees for a period of 90 days. But we did not believe that this was enough, and we worked with members of Congress to expand protection through the continuing resolution which passed last Thursday. So the legislation authorizes Afghans arriving with humanitarian parole to receive basically the same services as refugees through the traditional refugee resettlement program, including the Office of Refugee Resettlement Assistance, Reception and Placement, and other entitlement programs like food assistance. So this includes unaccompanied Afghan children who are now eligible for unaccompanied refugee minor services. But there's obviously still so much more that needs to be done in terms of offering stability to arriving Afghans following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So we believe that Congress must pass a bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act to ensure that these individuals who are coming under what is really a temporary status have access to a green card and a pathway to citizenship. An asylum only option, which is what the current parole system offers, is not sufficient because most of the Afghan evacuees left Kabul with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. While many had passports or IDs, they actually destroyed these documents on instruction from the US Embassy, because those documents, particularly those related to US affiliation, in order for them to navigate through Taliban checkpoints, would have been incredibly dangerous. So this lack of documentation creates a formidable barrier for Afghan asylum seekers, threatening their ability to remain in the United States and more broadly to remain safe. So we believe too that the administration should waive all application fees associated with humanitarian parole applications, at the very minimum for individuals with US ties or loved ones in the United States, as well as create an electronic application process for these applications. We know that access to refuge for those vulnerable, should not depend on whether or not a family can afford thousands of dollars in government filing fees. Those in fear of violence and persecution, including religious minorities, I know obviously we've, the panelists have spoken about the Hazara just as an example, should face as little resistance as possible in their pursuit of safety on our shores. And we believe it is fully within the government's power to ensure that it is so. The US has a moral obligation to provide hope and pathways for protection through a range of things, streamlining parole applications, reopening consular services, creating a pathway forward for Afghan allies in third countries, as well as establishing protections for particularly vulnerable groups left behind. But even for those who have arrived safely in the US, the challenges go beyond status. So our newly arrived Afghan neighbors have undergone significant trauma and must receive trauma-informed care. While there is hope for their future, they also grapple with the fear and anxiety associated with leaving, everything behind. They worry deeply for their parents, their siblings, other extended family members who are not able to escape. They already face politicized xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, which we must work actively to counter. And then, of course, they face logistical challenges. Many of the Afghans that LIRS and our partners have served, for example, seek to resettle in Northern Virginia, where housing is both expensive and scarce. So we need landlords that are willing to rent to Afghans without credit history. We need employers willing to hire Afghan employees. In short, we need communities of welcome, something the government has expressed support for through community sponsorship or co-sponsorship, but something that we believe should not fall solely on the shoulders of those willing to step up and show support. LIRS has resettled thousands of Afghans in our history, and we're prepared to resettle thousands more, including at-risk religious minorities. And so we look forward to working with our colleagues on this panel, as well as in the government, to serve all who seek safety on our shores, no matter who they pray to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank Palwasha and Krish again for their initial insights here. Before we start, I'm going to start with a question, but before we do that, I just want to remind the audience to ask a question by using the Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. And of course, we'll try to get to as many as possible, thanks to those that have already submitted questions, but go ahead and start that process if you will. I wanted to just start off, both of you touched on some of the things the US government could do. Another angle of that is, at this point, given the evacuation and given the Taliban's de facto power, being in power now, what leverage, if any, does the US government have over the Taliban to protect at-risk religious minorities? You've both referenced several of the most at-risk communities, to try to curb, offset, or lessen the violations. I mean, we just heard yesterday from a report by Amnesty International that at the end of August, there may have the Taliban is accused of killing extrajudicially 13 Hazara Shi'a, some of which were in the Afghan security forces. But at this point, given the situation, of course, the Taliban have made these commitments to the international community, saying they're evolving and so on, and that they won't do some of the things that happened 25 and 30 years ago. So if you could touch on what kind of leverage at this point, in your estimation, does the US government have to keep the Taliban accountable for violations?
I'm happy to start. I think two of the most important levers we can pull at the moment are the power of the purse and diplomatic pressure or recognition. I was just at a conference yesterday focused on immigration and met with a woman, who's from the Hazara minority, and she was providing personal accounts. Her family is still in Afghanistan, of how the Taliban have continued to commit these atrocities. And so this is where, when the Taliban talk about how they're the newer and better version, actions speak louder than words. And so I think that it is incredibly important. The US is going to be a critical partner in terms of foreign assistance in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are going to look to the US in terms of those financial resources. And so I believe that, whether it is protecting religious minorities, protecting women and girls, and allowing them to continue to, experience the empowerment and strength that they have shown in the last 2 decades, it is critically important that we withhold any assistance until we see those types of actions. And then the second is where the US will play a critical role, but frankly, the global community can play a critical role. Just in the last couple of weeks, we had global leaders in New York for the UN General Assembly, UNGA, and the Taliban had sought to seat an Afghan envoy. And I think that it's important that globally there is solidarity shown to say, until we see religious protections for all, until we see, adolescent girls in school across the country, that we will not recognize you as a legitimate government. And so I think those are 2 steps, especially since we do see that the Taliban are taking steps to get international recognition. There is an opportunity.
And I would actually second that. Thank you, Krish, for laying those out. I think the Taliban are seeking international legitimacy very clearly, and also the economy of Afghanistan is really in dire straits and they need international support. So those are 2 very key leverage points, and how the United States will partner with other countries to use those leverage points as a way of encouraging the Taliban to uphold their side of the agreement that was agreed in the peace process, related to inclusive government, related to human rights, and also related to protection of security. All of those things are really key and important here. And I think that including religious minorities in the whole understanding and protection of human rights is really key in understanding and advocating for how the Taliban should uphold their side of the deal. And also, we're talking about providing humanitarian aid, and in that we also do not want to give some sort of criteria for providing humanitarian aid. At the same time, there are ways to leverage that to ensure inclusion and to ensure that human rights are upheld. So I think those are 2 areas that we need to continue to focus on and as leverage.
Thank you. You both obviously refer to the power of the purse and the aid, and of course the Taliban is seeking, is desperate for aid. But if you touched on this, Palwasha, and it would be great if both of you could address this. How can we make sure that any aid that's going in does not get deflected by the Taliban? How can we get aid from the U.S. or international community to the at-risk communities without getting the Taliban involved? And I mean, we know the aid process, in so many, in past years in other countries, there are issues with it getting in there, but so many are in dire need. Do you have any thoughts on how that process might avert the Taliban redirecting the aid to those at-risk communities?
Well, I can start on this. I think it's really important that that we work with local partners on the ground that have credibility and have been able to navigate the realities on the ground with the Taliban. Of course, the UN is there. The UN is one outlet that have been able to navigate this, and they're one way. But ensuring that, for example, women are present to be able to give humanitarian aid to women, and that there are ways of or entry points into minority communities, and that there are people from among minority communities that are part of these aid organizations is really important. And so making those things clear, I think, with local organizations and partners is really important on the ground, and working with those organizations and partners that have been able to function on the ground. Of course, they're the ones that then know how to navigate the system with the Taliban and have been able to navigate the system. And I think finding those channels is really our best bet in terms of getting the humanitarian aid directly to the people who are most in need on the ground.
Krish, did you have anything to add?
No, I just completely agree. I mean, I do think, what is fortunate over 2 decades there is that we have, strong USAID partners, international humanitarian organizations. And so I agree that there is a way in which as Palwasha had said, we can get the assistance to those who need it without worrying about the Taliban trying to grift off of it.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks again, everyone who's sending in questions. We're going to try to get to as many. Before we turn to you in the audience, though, I wanted to check with our chair, Nadine Maenza, and Commissioner Fred Davie to see if they had any comments or questions at this time for the panelists.
Thank you so much, Dwight. And thank you so much to our panelists. You both, I took so many notes, really provided helpful information that is hard to decipher when you're trying to keep up on the breaking news going on with all the information coming out of Afghanistan. But I know, Krish, you mentioned about the Afghan Adjustment Act that you hope Congress will pass soon. Is it a possibility for them to include religious minorities being a part of P2 or another way for them to come in as well in that piece of legislation?
Yeah, so what is nice is that the State Department actually in August did designate kind of special protection through the P2 program for Afghanistan as an area of concern. And so there is an opportunity that is now more robust in terms of, resettling religious minorities. So it is, the Adjustment Act is more for individuals who came in through humanitarian parole, okay, who would then just be adjusted to refugee resettlement, because the humanitarian parole is really just a temporary status, right? It just allows for admission into the US. And so our hope is, rather than having them move into the asylum, backlog, that there is a way to kind of more efficiently and effectively move them into what they would be process typically if we kind of had a more functioning system, which was as special immigrant visa holders or as refugees, including the religiously persecuted.
Thank you.
I too want to thank both of the panelists for this information, and I agree with Chair Maenza. It's very hard to keep up with sort of every piece of late-breaking news that comes in on Afghanistan, and it's certainly sort of heartbreaking, needless to say, to see what has transpired there and so quickly. As you have mentioned, there are these efforts to get Afghanistan families and Afghan individuals resettled in the US. And I'm just wondering, for those who are listening and tuning in today, as well as those who will view this recording once it's posted online, what can they do to be most helpful to families and individuals from Afghanistan who are resettling here in the United States?
Well, Frederick, I very much appreciate that question. So I'll start. It is a historic moment, and I think whenever I travel across the country, I always get someone who comes up to me and very proudly speaks about their experience of having resettled a Vietnamese refugee. And I think that this is our generation's moment in terms of the scale of the resettlement that we're undertaking. And honestly, this is an all hands on deck effort. And part of that is because of the tens of thousands of families who have arrived. And part of it is because the infrastructure in terms of refugee resettlement was decimated over the last few years. And so we're not just trying to go from 0 to 60, but we're going from some negative number to 60. And so this is an effort where anyone out there who wants to learn how to get involved, please, you can go to lirs.org and you'll see a Take Action tab. But we're looking for everything from volunteers who would be willing to help pick up families from the airport, to furnish their apartments with donated furniture, to even stock the refrigerator with culturally familiar foods, to serve as drivers for medical appointments or mentors in the English language, to help with students who will be entering the public school systems. As I mentioned, employers, renters. We've had wonderful offers of private citizens who have an empty apartment that they've been willing to donate. So it's really been amazing. We've had more than 48,000 volunteers who have signed up in the last 6 weeks to help in this work of welcome. But even that isn't going to be enough in terms of the long-term effort that we're undertaking. Obviously, if there's cash, assistance that you might be able to provide, that's always helpful, just because we are having landlords ask us for 6 months of rent upfront. And so that's kind of, where the cash assistance goes. In-kind donations, laptops, SIM cards. We have in our offices and headquarters, we have diaper towers. So, you can learn on the website exactly what the specific needs are at a given moment. But really, no matter where you are in the country, I guarantee you there will be a family relocating somewhere near. So we'd love to stay in touch, and I really appreciate the question.
Great, thank you very much. Well, why don't we now turn to the audience questions, and you can continue to ask them, try to get them in if you haven't yet. Question, pretty frank question about, how does the Taliban view or treat those who leave Islam or have a different interpretation of Islam? And the question, should it not be that they recognize the right to have or adopt a religion or belief of one's choice and practice? So there's clearly history there, but I wanted to know if Palwasha wanted to address that about the Taliban's view of apostasy. There's a pretty extensive record on that.
Yeah, for sure. That Taliban do not tolerate apostasy. And that's something that we've seen as a trend in not only among the Taliban, but other Muslim countries, unfortunately, as well. And that's a really contentious issue in terms of allowing freedom of choice, religious choice. So, there have been executions in the past. I haven't heard anything now since the Taliban have taken over on specifics related to apostasy at this point. So we have yet to see what will happen, but we do know that they have a track record on this in Afghanistan. So it's a problem, I think, in other countries as well too, in terms of knowing how to navigate that and working with religious leaders and with religious authorities on defining freedom of religion within an Islamic framework. And for example, the verse in the Quran, La ikraha fi din, that there's no compulsion in religion, how that's being understood, defined, and interpreted is really important. And so working with religious leaders is important on that aspect. But it is an issue that we've seen in the past, the Taliban killing those who have converted.
Speaking of those who've converted or others in general who disagree with the interpretation, there's a few questions on some of the vulnerable groups, including the LGBTI community. If anyone can speak to what's happening there, as well as mention of the Shia Hazara, Hindus, Sikhs, and so on. Are there any? Is there any information about the persecution of Christians as well? So those are two groups that there's some questions about.
I have not specifically heard anything, and I've been the last few days trying to see if I could gather reports related to persecution of Christians. I've not heard anything. I've not heard any information around that. With regard to Hazaras, as you mentioned, I think Commissioner Fred Davie had mentioned the killings of Hazaras. There has been a lot of back and forth related to posturing and threats between Hazaras, those who were, for example, trained among the Fatimiyun in Iran and Syria, that have come back and have been making posturing and threats towards the Taliban, and the Taliban posturing and threats back to them. But the final word that I've heard so far is the Taliban are saying, well, we've been ordered not to kill any Hazaras, and we're following that order. And so officially, they are saying, we do not have permission to kill Hazaras or to, to fight against them. And we saw also in Kabul, soon after the Taliban took over, the Taliban, the Hazara community and the Shia Hazara community negotiated with the Taliban for them to be allowed to have their Ashura processions in Kabul city. And they were allowed to have their Ashura processions within Kabul city. What I've heard is that there have been extensive negotiations between the Hazara community and the Taliban for them to allow them to have their places of worship and to continue to worship. And so that's what I've heard so far on that end. With regard to LGBTQI, I know that the demands from that community is that they be allowed to either leave the country or be allowed to live safely within the country. So far, I think at this time, the mode is really how do we get out and how can we leave the country? I haven't heard of direct action taken against LGBTQI, but I do know that they do feel threatened because the Taliban are there, as do other communities, including religious minority communities that we've talked about in Afghanistan. I do know that actions have been taken out very, like there hasn't been a cover-up of Taliban trying to kill, for example, people of the Ahl al-Hadith, which are a Salafist group that they disagree with, that are seen to follow certain Saudi clerics. And so there has been really open antagonism and not fighting, but assassinations of those people who claim to be of the Ahl al-Hadith group, or who have been found to have videos on their phones related to the Ahl al-Hadith. And I asked about that to understand a little bit of the background as to why they think it's okay, and they feel that they are giving a message to that Salafi group who they feel has spoken out against them and against their jihad very publicly, to say, you know, we are against you and we will not tolerate you. So we do see that on issues of religious belief, they are showing intolerance. But right now, it seems like the highest level is towards the Sunni Ahl al-Hadith. The assassinations, the disappearances of people around Hazaras, that's happening. Also others that they're having disagreement with. And that adds to a whole psychological warfare against people who disagree with them, because there's this fear that they live in. And so having these assassinations, these disappearings, nobody knows exactly for what reason, they can speculate in it. It causes a lot of people to live in fear of their life, whether they have actually experienced direct interactions or threats themselves, but because of what's happening and the unknown about it, causes a lot of psychological fear. And so what we're hearing among a lot of the minority communities is, because this is happening, they want out, they want to leave Afghanistan as much as possible. There are small groups that are saying they want to stay, they want to be able to figure out how to work, but majority are saying that they feel threatened because of what's going on and they would like to leave the country, and they're trying to find avenues to leave the country.
Thank you. This next one, I think, is more focused with for Krish. As you mentioned, some of the challenges. There's a question that says there appears to be something of a catch-22 for at-risk individuals attempting to leave Afghanistan, including religious minorities. On the one hand, the U.S. government is apparently no longer supplying any documentation to individuals seeking to leave Afghanistan, but still located there. And they say, I hope this is a mistaken understanding. On the other hand, neighboring countries apparently are not permitting individuals to enter their countries without proof that they can be relocated to a third country. Is there some hope for those still in Afghanistan seeking visa-type assistance from the U.S. government?
I sure hope so, because, you know, kudos to the military in terms of, you know, evacuating 124,000, but we know that history won't just judge us for how many people got out, but of course, how many people were left behind and vulnerable because of their work, either directly for the US government or on behalf of championing ideals that we shared with some Afghans. It is accurate that you know, the reports we have heard as well are that that neighboring countries are saying you can only enter so long as you have transit out, that they do not want to be a host country in the long term. And, you know, that isn't as problematic as it may seem, because there are a number of countries who have thankfully stepped up in terms of showing leadership. But this is where the US has to play a principal leadership role, not just because of our role over the last 2 decades, but also just to contextualize it. You know, we just ended the fiscal year 2021, and we resettle through the refugee resettlement system the lowest number of refugees in the history of the program, meaning over 4 decades, lower by a few hundred than even the lowest figure during President Trump's administration. And so this is where we have the capacity to resettle more of these individuals and families. And so to the comment about the documentation, our understanding is the state continues to be committed to processing these individuals. It is not going to be easy because, as noted in the question and as I described earlier, the U.S. embassy had given guidance to these individuals to destroy any paperwork that would have connected them to the U.S. government. And so this is where we need to create workarounds in terms of, we do have databases that provide certain information. We should be able to look it up on our end, even if these families, individuals are not able to provide the documents that we ask them to destroy. And in our conversations with the State Department, it does seem like there is an intention, but as of now, we don't have the robust consular affairs in country, because we don't have a U.S. embassy presence there. And so the question is, what presence will there be in neighboring countries like Pakistan that has more than 1 million Afghans who have, been displaced and moved there, Uzbekistan, other countries as well.
Thank you. This next question is for Palwasha, and they appreciated your comprehensive and compelling test. I guess the list from, the importance of equal rights and specific laws in the Constitution, protection for minorities, etc. Asking you, so far, do you feel like they see these as huge leaps, but do you see any seeds of hope already coming from on the Afghan side, meaning I guess the Taliban, to some of these more international standards and protections that you're referring to that need to be put in place?
I think that's a difficult conversation that needs to be had, because the Taliban are saying that they are trying to provide security. They are making statements, like I said, that they will not target Hazaras or not fight against Hazaras, at least officially. That they will protect religious minorities, Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan. In fact, they went to the Gurdwara and said, we will protect you and we will provide security for you, don't worry. And of course, the question is then, if they're saying that those are their values and that's something that they're trying to do, is there a way to say, okay, now we have common values, how can we help each other on these issues? Or we're seeing that there's criminal activity, are there ways for you to crack down on this criminal activity to ensure and provide security for religious minorities and the public in general? I think, it seems like there would be ways to start those conversations, particularly with the international community coming to them and recognizing, okay, you've said this, so let's work with you on this. You're saying that you will protect these communities, that you have these values to bring security, to give these communities rights to worship, rights to live in Afghanistan. But again, I think seeing where exactly that conversation would lie is difficult, and finding those entry points are difficult right now for the national community. And it's also a very controversial issue, considering that, on the one hand, we saw in the beginning protests were being allowed, the Taliban were allowing those things, and then we saw that there were threats, shots being fired in the air and threats happening against women who were protesting. So there are things like that picture sort of given to the international community, but then something else happening on the inside. And so how do we help them be consistent? We are aware that internally within the Taliban, there are disagreements, that not all of the different Taliban groups are on the same page where it comes to what Islamic governance means, what it means to protect citizen rights, what are human rights, those kinds of things. So how do we encourage them to overcome some of those disputes internally, and also really follow through on some of the commitments that they've been trying to make publicly, I think is the question here. And it seems like the international community would have that entry point at some level to do that, to have some of those difficult conversations, particularly with the US peace agreement with the Taliban, if there's ways to build on that, but also finding, for example, maybe some intermediaries like the UN who are already there, the Red Crescent who are there, different organizations that are able to function there to start having some of those conversations on building upon at least what they're claiming to do in terms of protecting rights and security and those sorts of things.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. And I think the final question that we can get to, will be for both of you, and you just alluded at the end there. According to the question here, the current Office of Foreign Assets Control general licenses for humanitarian assistance cover a small portion of what is needed in terms of humanitarian aid. For example, it doesn't cover education, apparently. The licenses do not cover atrocity prevention, human rights, women's rights work in Afghanistan. Given the urgent importance of protection for religious and ethnic minority communities, what more can be done to ensure that organizations doing this kind of work in humanitarian assistance resettlement in Afghanistan, trying to get people resettled, are able to continue receiving funding to do this work within the current sanctions regime or limitations? Any thoughts on that?
Krish, I think this is more your area.
I wish. No, so I honestly, I know this is about operating in Afghanistan, and I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of details on the operating side within, U.S. government policies and what's and how they're operating within Afghanistan to give more details on this. But I do know that organizations that are working on the ground are really important, and those that are currently being able to provide safe houses for people in Afghanistan, those who are able to work on evacuations of those from Afghanistan are really key, because we're seeing a lot of these minority communities are trying to get out, as well as those who are feeling persecuted for other reasons. And so continuing that assistance in those evacuations are really important.
Thank you very much. Since we're coming to the end of our hour, I did want to ask Chair Maenza and Commissioner Davie if they had any final words to impart, either for the panelists or comments.
Well, thank you again so much for your willingness to come today and talk to us about this. And I also appreciate, Krish, you giving people some advice on how they can be a part of welcoming this community into the United States. I think it's such an important moment for us as a country to come together, regardless of your political opinion of how it played out, to welcome these families into the United States. So I'm excited to see how much I've seen in my own community, people excited to welcome this community. So I appreciate you encouraging everybody to take a look at for families in their own neighborhood, their own state that they could support. And again, I just want to say thank you so much. And thanks to the USCIRF team for putting together such a fabulous event.
I echo Chair Maenza's comments and say a heartfelt thank you to our panelists for the information they've provided, and always to the USCIRF staff for the good job they've done in organizing today's conversation. So thank you.
Well, let me thank our two commissioners there, Chair Nadine Maenza and Commissioner Fred Davie, for their insights today. And of course, our two distinguished panelists, Palwasha Kakar and Krish Vignarajah, for sharing their really helpful expertise and information to all of us today. I also want to thank Danielle Ashbahian, USCIRF Supervisory Public Affairs Officer, and Naila Mohammed, USCIRF Senior Policy Analyst, and John Lechner, our Policy Analyst, for putting together this event. If you'd like to learn more about USCIRF's work on religious freedom in Afghanistan, I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and issues in the weeks and months ahead. Thanks for tuning in today and your attention on these important issues, and we'll see you next time on USCIRF Conversations. Have a great day.